Hey there, we're online.
Hey guys.
So sound test, can everyone hear us?
Hello, test, 1, 2, 3.
Hello, hello.
Hello, hello.
I can hear Sunny and Marek, which is probably the most important thing.
All right, I think we're good. So for this panel, we're going to basically talk about what makes a good network custodian, and it'll be a candid discussion on incentive alignment. We have Sunny, Marek, and Konstantin here, and I will let them take it from here.
Okay, cool. So yeah, welcome everybody. I'm going to be a sort of mini MC here, just to make sure that we incorporate questions from the audience, as well as make sure to kind of keep everyone on track here, and define what it is when we talk about network custody, what makes a good network participant, a validator, from a numerous different perspectives, right? And so maybe we start off just with a kind of sort of two-sided introduction. Both of you guys obviously are people who are active building actual protocols in this space, which is something I don't think had the chance to talk with and about in this particular setting. We've had people talk about how to set up validators, how to be a good validator, but it'll be great to hear a little more, one, about the project that you are currently working on, which are both of those are, obviously projects that I would assume a lot of people know, but who knows who's listening. And then secondary, about yourself a little bit, your background and what got you excited in blockchain. And then I'll do the same last. Should we start with the left side on my screen? Sunny, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Hey guys, my name is Sunny, and I am one of the core developers and researchers on the Cosmos project. And so I work a lot on doing a lot of the development for the Cosmos Hub, or as I like to call it, Gaia, and help design a lot of the staking module there, as well as some other stuff like the governance and stuff. And then I also, in order to understand both sides of the field, I put on another hat sometimes where I also run the Sikka validator. And so it's one of the largest validators on the Cosmos Hub. And then we're also running on a couple of other incentivized testnets nowadays, including the Celo testnet.
Great. Marek, how about you?
Yeah, so hello everyone. So I'm Marek. I'm the CTO and one of the co-founders of C Labs, which is one of the companies working on Celo. Before Celo, I co-founded kind of a machine learning company called Loku out of MIT, where I was doing my PhD. I think I first got interested in kind of Web3 and decentralized technologies at MIT. Loku was actually spun out of Tim Berners-Lee's kind of lab, where he was focusing on kind of the original Web3, which he was calling the semantic web. Some people know it as kind of linked data. The vision was to do to data what he did to documents back in the day when he invented the web. For those who don't know, Celo is a kind of protocol really focused on advancing financial inclusion. We're really working hard to create a fully decentralized permissionless protocol that allows you to create a mobile app that looks like a lightweight bank account. One of the, I think, pretty cool features of Celo is that you can send money to phone numbers in a fully permissionless way, even before someone installs the app on the receiving side.
Cool. Yeah, I'm Konstantin. I'm CEO and founder of BlockDaemon. We're a middleware tooling platform. We intend to bring CloudFormation tooling to the node space and have been doing so for 2 years. So we're all about democratizing node running. We run, this might be a hyperbolic startup founder statement, but I think we're the largest node runners in the world, based only on the way our platform works. We're still the only platform in the space where you can actually go with a credit card and buy and deploy a full validator, and you can click that button 100 times, and then you've deployed 100 validators if you want to pay for it. But we do that for Bitcoin, Ethereum, and a bunch of other tokens that aren't yet protocols that aren't currently proof of stake as well. But we're building tooling around layer 1 deployments across the lifespan of protocols. And so We will talk a little bit about how these guys see their projects evolve, but maybe, Marek, you touched on it a little bit. Sunny, it'll be great to hear a little bit more about Cosmos. And then if you both could talk a little bit about your consensus mechanism and some of the technical considerations that you've put in place that you're really concerned about. Maybe we start there and then take it down to the validator level.
Yeah, sure. So so Cosmos is a project that was begun in about late 2016, early 2017, where the premise is we see all these new applications coming and building on these Turing complete blockchains like Ethereum and whatnot, which I think like the smart contracting platforms are useful for some purposes, particularly for what they sound like, which is for smart contracting. But for larger scale applications, we think that applications we really believe in this like application specific blockchain vision where you have different applications sort of on their own chains. They each have their own validator set that's decided somehow, whether it's by proof of stake or authority or even proof of work if you wanted. And then you have a way for all these blockchains to be able to send tokens and data amongst each other. So you still have the composability that you get in like Ethereum like systems, but you also get the sovereignty of like application specific blockchain. So that's kind of what the Cosmos project is. And to that extent, we've been building a bunch of tooling, particularly Tendermint core, which I guess I'll talk about in a second, which answers the second part of your question. The Cosmos SDK, which is a framework to build applications, and IBC, which is a generalized sidechain protocol to allow two blockchains to like sort of, they might have different consensus protocols, different frameworks, but they can do a handshake with each other and explain to each other how they both work. And so that way they can start communicating. So yeah, as mentioned, Tendermint Core is the primary consensus protocol that most of the blockchains that are like, in the Cosmos ecosystem are using. It is a consensus protocol that was developed by Jaquan back in 2014. He was essentially, at that time, no one was really looking into using BFT consensus protocols for blockchains. BFT was sort of this like long forgotten thing from like the 90s, and everyone was like, all the chains that were coming around then, even the proof of stake ones, are all sort of using some sort of Nakamoto consensus. And Jay's idea was, he came across like PBFT and DLS and other protocols and kind of started modifying and adapting them to be more functional for usable in a blockchain scenario, and made them so they can actually work over P2P networks, and so that you can have like rotating proposers and all the sort of things that help it work in a more decentralized system. And so the Cosmos Hub, or the Gaia blockchain, it uses Tendermint Core, as do most of the chains built with the Cosmos SDK today.
Okay, and can you give us a little some scalability? How many nodes are live on the network? What's the current network activity?
Sure. So currently we have 100 and on the Gaia chain, we have 125 validators, and that is one of the cons of BFT protocols, at least in a a simplistic model like Tendermint, is that you require n squared communication between all of the validator nodes. And so this is a bit of a this does make it harder to scale to like having millions of validator nodes, because the amount of like, you could do it, but you could probably do it if you wanted like 10-minute blocks like Bitcoin. But if you want to get away with like the 2 to 5 second blocks that the Cosmos Hub can achieve, then you really don't want to go above maybe a couple thousand validators at most. And and when we developed Tendermint, we knew that Tendermint is not like the end all be all of like blockchains. Like we saw it as a 10x over like Nakamoto consensus, but we knew that there were still many more like 1.1x improvements or 2x improvements or 3x improvements to be made. Some of them including stuff like BLS aggregation, which the Celo team has done a great job of actually taking those ideas and putting them into practice.
Yeah, and so the current limitation is really a balance of needed network performance, right? And so maybe, Marek, maybe that's a good handover to you guys, because you guys have some ideas about that. So it'd be great to hear a little more about Celo. You just touched on it, like the consensus mechanisms, as well as the the architecture you're envisioning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we're big fans of Cosmos. I think a lot of the ideas behind the consensus engine at Celo was inspired by both Tendermint and the Cosmos Hub. And so Celo also has a BFT-based consensus protocol. We built ours mostly from scratch for a number of reasons. And similarly to Cosmos, the protocol through kind of stake effectively elects 100 validators who then perform the PBFT kind of n-squared based consensus. And then we have 5-second block periods as well. A few differences, I would say. One thing that we really tried hard, I think, given our mobile focus, is to create a protocol that has a very efficient like client sync protocol. And so this means that we want anybody on a mobile phone to be able to sync with the peer-to-peer network with just a couple of seconds and only downloading a couple of kilobytes worth of data, rather than trying to download every header from the beginning of the network launch, which is what's typical on other networks. And the way we accomplish that is one, through using those BLS signature aggregation techniques that Sunny just alluded to. So all of the validators in the network, all of their signatures when they sign off on a particular header or on a particular block, all those signatures get aggregated into a single multi-signature that's the same size as a regular signature. So that means that we can keep adding more and more validators without the header size growing. And then the other, I think, interesting difference is we chose to make it so that validators can only come and join the kind of quorum, the PBFT quorum, once per day instead of at any point in time. And then this means that if you were to download the headers, you would only have to download the last header of each of these days. And then finally, and this is the thing that I'm probably the most excited about, we chose to do these BLS signing and aggregation on a fairly new elliptic curve called BLS 12377, which just happens to be a curve that allows you to recurse into a bigger curve to perform snark operations to perform pairing operations as part of a snark. Which allows you to actually create a snark proof that proves the like client protocol that basically checks all of these headers and checks that the signatures are correct, so that in the end, instead of downloading all those headers, you could just download a single 400-byte snark proof that a full node can generate and kind of give you as a like client. And so I think those are the big changes on the number of validators. I think as all, I think, proof-of-stake protocols, I think everyone's interested in increasing those numbers to be as high as possible. I think for the security of the network, for just the viability of these networks to be more decentralized, better alternatives to what exists today in the proof-of-work world, it's critical for us to get those numbers up higher and higher. If you're interested in some ways that we're looking at doing that, I highly recommend checking out a paper called BF Tree that we've written, which basically uses a tree of validators and a reputation system to allow us to basically break that n-squared complexity on the communication, make it much smaller, make it actually logarithmic, so that we can increase the number of validators to thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, potentially even millions. That's all kind of TBD work. Right now, we're just focused on getting to launch. We're looking to launch basically in the first half of this year.
Well, yeah, and that's one of the things we're super excited about as a infrastructure tooling platform, obviously, is how do we extend the number of nodes. We're not a staking as a service provider, so for us, we want to have tools that are helping other people to run nodes, and ideally a lot of nodes, right? So for us, it's always interesting when we talk to folks, and our own capitalization models is that, we operate in a world, or we want to operate in a world, and there's, in which networks have thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, millions of nodes over time. So that's a huge accomplishment to do on network architecture. Maybe one interesting thing, since Marek, you've mentioned it, and Sunny, maybe we start with you guys, because it's interesting. So when you launch a mainnet, and Cosmos was one of the first big ones that launched, and a lot of guys learned how to validate on your network. What were the sort of initial concerns when you launched the network, in terms of like, what were really the key fears here in terms of, and we just talked before this, Mark, you were talking about, you don't want to rebalance your network. There's certain things you want to avoid. Like, Sunny, can you tell us about how that experience was for you? And then Marek, you can talk to us about how you're hoping your experience is going to be and what you're trying to avoid.
Yeah, sure. So I guess when we got to launch of the Cosmos Hub, we ran this process called Game of Stakes, which is this like long incentivized test net that ran a bit longer than expected, but maybe like 3 months or so leading up to the launch of the network. And I would say that there were about a couple of different goals of the Game of Stakes, some of which I think it accomplished quite well, some of which I think maybe not quite so much. So some of the goals, right? One of them was to get validators up to technical competence and like practice operational security of running mainnet validators. 2 was get them accustomed to the software. 3 was test our software. Lot of bugs in the software were actually caught during the live Game of Stakes testnet because people were, getting people to actually be using the software is the best way to, catch these bugs, because it actually tests like what real usage patterns people do. And then we realized, oh, okay, we didn't account for this edge case that turns out people actually do. That was one. And then finally, it was to further help distribute the tokens. So, the Cosmos Hub, the tokens, the fundraiser took place almost 2 years prior to the launch of the network, all the way back in April 2017. And a lot of the validators that had arisen over those course of those 2 years who were interested in participating in the network didn't have tokens. And it's hard to, participate in proof of stake if you don't have those tokens. And so one of the things that Game of Stakes did pretty well was actually, create a way of distributing those tokens to those validators so that they could participate. And that's one thing I think it did pretty well. We had, I forgot what the exact numbers were, but at least 50 winners or something who all got some token allocation so that
How many of those 50s are currently live? Sorry, I'm just curious.
I'm not sure. I know it's not 100% of them, because I know there are some who I know off the top of my head who are no longer in the network. But I would say the vast majority of them, and a lot of the like top participants from those Game of Stakes are now also like some of the largest validators in the Cosmos Hub.
Yeah, very interesting. And I'm intrigued. I'm going to make a little note here. I'm sorry for interrupting you, but Marek, I'm going to ask you the same question: what you think will happen, because you're operating in a very different world. Cosmos kind of started the sort of validator staking business. Now you have a lot of cats like us who are a lot more sophisticated, partner with funds, and so suddenly, how many validators participated in the Cosmos Game of Stake? And then I'm curious, Marek, later, how many actually participated in yours?
I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I think there was at least 200.
Oh, wow.
Over about 200. It should be taken into account that some of them were Sybil attacks from validators that were like part of the game. But I think like legitimate operators, I think there were at least like 80 or so.
Okay. That's exciting. And then what were the key issues, like problems you guys came about?
Yeah, so I would say, okay, so, I think I did a good job of getting validators accustomed to the software. One thing I would say where it things didn't go quite, in my opinion, I think it didn't achieve its goal, was to teach validators to use the operational security that they need. And people, from my experience, a lot of validators during the game of stakes, they actually were not running in their like mainnet environment. They weren't running with HSMs.
Right.
And one kind of annoying thing was that if you want, you want to what we kind of did in a weird way was we actually like turned on like hyper inflation, because the idea was like, all right, let's simulate like long-term network environments in like the span of a few months of game of stakes. And so the inflation rate was set to like some absurd amount. But what this meant was you had to if you wanted to stay in the game, you had to like basically constantly be withdrawing your rewards and then redelegating them. And because of this process, if you wanted to do this like as frequently as possible, like on an hourly basis or something, and so people actually just wrote scripts and kept their keys like on hot live on a script so that they could keep auto redelegating their rewards, which, Sikka actually quickly fell out of the competition because we were we weren't allowed to win because of our relationship with Tendermint. So we decided, instead of trying to win, we're just going to practice our operational security. And so we actually used like a multi-sig with different hardware wallets and stuff during the game of stakes. But because of that, we weren't able to auto redelegate us fast enough. That was required. That was what's kind of necessary to play in the game. And so I think that going forward, future game of stakes like system, they should try to do more to incentivize people to actually run in their mainnet like environments.
Yeah, great point. Well, so Marek, so how are you guys getting on? You're currently right in it, right? Like, so it's a lot happening in real time. We had something happening earlier. I think people were like, thinking, is the network getting attacked while you're sitting on the computer? So tell us about, what were your main thoughts and where are you now with it? Obviously, you have similar setups we've seen where, initially it's easy for people to go after rewards and neglect security, and then you catch them a little later, but it can tweak the balance of how rewards are paid out.
Yeah, absolutely. And huge kudos to Sunny for kind of sharing his experience with the Cosmos game of stakes. I think a lot of the design and thinking behind the Celo stake-off really came out from conversations with Sunny and others who have kind of gone through this before. And it's really hard, right? How do you create a competition where you're solely using the incentives built into the protocol to help people compete for these rewards without really kind of incentivizing them to have bad OPSEC? We found it quite tricky. And one of the ideas that we ended up landing on is, one of the nice things about a stake-off is you can actually do things, you can create incentives that are not fully permissionless, that are not fully decentralized. And we wanted to use those to bootstrap kind of a healthy network. And so one thing that we're doing is we're actually hiring external firms to audit the security of all of our validators. We have kind of Master Chef Challenge. Everything at Celo is kind of food themed. And if you agree to one of these audits, you can actually boost your rewards in the stake-off itself, and actually use that to your advantage. So if you've gone to the trouble for setting up a device in a colo with redundant internet, power, cooling, all of those things, if you've gone to the trouble to encrypt your whole hard drive, to set up good firewall kind of rules, to actually do signing with a hardware wallet. We're working really hard to release a Ledger Nano X app that can sign on that fairly big and new BLS 12377 curve. If you go to the effort of doing all these things that Sunny was doing with his own validator but didn't get rewarded for, we want to reward you in a kind of a more centralized manner, because in the stake-off we can do that. And we hope that that people will then, after having gone through all of this effort, will actually keep that effort going forward, and we can launch with a very secure network. I think another thing that is different about Celo is we want each of the validator nodes to have equal voting weight in the BFT consensus protocol to be more kind of decentralized, and we also want the people who are electing these folks to have to do less due diligence than in other networks. Really, as a person delegating, or to use kind of Celo's vernacular, voting for validators, you want to always pick the best validators out there who are adhering to these best OPSEC practices. And so with Celo, we added almost an extra level of indirection in the form of validator groups. And so you're not actually voting for validators, you're voting for validator groups, and then those validator groups take on validators who they think are adhering to good OPSEC practices. And so what we hope that these audits will be kind of a playbook that validator groups in the future will be able to actually use to kind of audit their own validators that they're taking on into their groups to kind of show to the whole community that these folks are worth voting for, and they can be trusted.
One of the downsides of that is obviously that it means that validator entities need to negotiate a lot with other validators, and there is this sort of like, who do you partner up with? How engaged do you get on the economical discussions? Because there's an underlying, underneath it all, these guys who control a lot of tokens, and a lot of the validator companies these days obviously are associated to them, right? So that's is interesting how that's going to work. I think that's going to be really exciting to see. I do want to touch on a question. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think this might potentially increase entrance costs, because there's a lot more sort of politicking, and you need to have connections to existing validators to be able to join some of these groups?
It's an interesting question. I don't know. I think one thing that it does do is it splits up marketing from kind of running a good validator. In other proof of stake networks, you're responsible for getting out there and getting people to delegate to you. And that involves typically building a brand for yourself, typically being upfront about who you are, where you are. Things that I think for people coming from the proof of work network space maybe will be kind of new and interesting. But with this extra level of indirection, really the validator group is the one that's going to have to go out there and market itself. That's the one that's going to have to build a brand. And then the validators themselves, hopefully, and we'll see if this happens, but hopefully it's going to be the ones who can prove to these validator groups that they maintain the best OPSEC, that they are the most trustworthy, that they know what they're doing. We hope that those are the ones who are going to be kind of admitted to these validator groups. And validator groups have an incentive to accept only the ones that they trust the most, because they can get slashed if the validator misbehaves. And so on one hand, I think absolutely there's more requirements around OPSEC. On the other hand, there's less requirements around marketing. And so I think we'll have to see how that plays out. It's definitely been really interesting to watch this in this takeoff. There's a lot of people teaming up in this takeoff in ways that are kind of permitted by the competition. This is new, right? This didn't really exist in other networks, and so I think people are still trying to wrap their heads around how this should work in this takeoff, and more importantly, how will this actually work in the mainnet. It's kind of interesting to watch.
Right. And I want to touch on slashing, just because obviously it's something that folks always debate, and it impacts validator economics as well, more and more. And so, Sunny, you guys obviously, Cosmos had one infamous slashing event, right? So for double signing. And I'm just curious, what considerations were you guys making when you set up your system? What are the considerations you have now? Same for Marek, obviously. Validators initially don't like slashing. Protocols rely on it in order to ensure security and performance. And so, as the protocol builders, what's your what are the thoughts behind slashing?
Yeah, so I guess one of the main design decisions that we made, which is I think different than some other ones like Tezos and Celo, is that we think that all stakers, whether they're delegators or validators, should be subject to slashing risk, and so that way that incentivizes delegators to really think carefully about who they're delegating to, and it also helps from legal reasons as well. That the delegators are also, similarly slashable as the validators. So I think that was sort of one big one. The other thing that I think, one of the things I think about how slashing right now, how the Cosmos Hub works is that 5% of 5% of a validator's stake is slashed if there's a double sign, and some tiny percent, 0.1% or something small, is slashed if there's a liveness fault. And these were kept to be very small originally because just as the network launches, and then bugs might be in the software and stuff, and the idea was these are going to be ramped up later. I have written a spec and code for this thing called proportional slashing, where essentially what it does is it punishes larger validators for double signing or going offline much more severely than it does smaller validators. And it also takes into account if multiple validators fault at roughly the same time, then they also get slashed much more severely. Because the way Tendermint works and most BFT protocols is that if 1% of the stake double sign, it doesn't actually in any way negatively affect the protocol, right? There's no way of them breaking the safety or finality of the consensus protocol. All it does is that it increases the risk. Okay, if 1% slash, that means now there's another 32% that needs to double sign rather than 33%. And so the more closer and closer you get to 33% of the network doing some sort of Byzantine behavior, the more and more dangerous and risky it gets, which is why I personally want slashing to follow that as well. If 30% of the network is offline, that is it's not 30 times worse than 1% of the network being offline. It's exponentially worse than 1% of the network being offline. And so I think the slashing should somewhat mirror the amount of risk you pose to the safety of the network. And so that's what I think.
Neural networks copied that quite well. Polkadot is all about that stuff, right? For example, that's been, and I'd love to see, it's so curious, right? Because you also can't discount the economical pressures of if that would happen, a lot of the people that heavily backed your project very, very early on might lose a significant amount of their tokens for no fault of their own, right? So the
fault of their own would be for double signing, right?
Well, but they would delegate, most of them delegate to a validator, and then they, keep their fingers crossed. And that's kind of, as a validator company, what we see a lot, obviously, is that there's a lot of bigger behind-the-scenes deals to kind of secure large token holdings, which ultimately means they're a lot less flexible for redelegation.
Yeah.
And then
so that's good because we want to incentivize those large holders to instead delegate to a larger array of validators rather than.
That's not a realistic, a large investor will never, that's not a realistic outcome, because the big thing for large investors is that they need to protect their principal. So they need the risk to be really kind of at zero, or they might not stake at all, because they're really going after the return of the increased value of the network, right? And so I'm just, kind of one of the things we see a lot is that what happens is that they kind of team up with one entity and then do all different protocols across them, because they're comfortable that either they invest in them or there's other kind of structures in place to present that. I'm curious to see if that's going to be the outcome.
So, I'm not stopping people from doing that. All I'm saying is that
I don't think it's good for your network.
You impose a risk on the network, and
right.
all I'm doing, I'm not decreasing your rewards if you do this. I'm just making your slashing risk higher, your slashing amount higher. So, if you do that and they never default, then okay, great, you know, you can do that.
Yeah.
It says that if they double sign, then you know the additional risk you board on the network is passed on to you rather than as just like externality to everyone else.
I have to live in my basement if that happens. But and so Marek, how does that work for you guys, and how do you guys see that play out?
Yeah, we went back and forth quite a while when designing the protocol to decide whether or not ultimately the people voting, which is again our term for delegating, should be slashed for these offenses. And we ended up deciding against it because we introduced this extra level of indirection. And so we thought, well, I think, you know, some of these big, you know, token holders and backers might be fairly sophisticated and might be able to do a good job of trying to figure out which validator they ultimately trust the most. You know, we are trying to build a protocol that has as diverse number of people voting as possible, and with the more people that you reach, the less likely it is that they'll be able to really, you know, have the same access, for example, as some of your customers who can, you know, go and have a conversation with you and really do a lot of due diligence. And so for that reason, we don't slash the voters. But we do have slashing for validator groups if one of the validators in their group misbehaves. And so again, we've kind of offloaded this onus to these validator groups, and we hope that because you know, it can be costly for them, it can affect their brand. You know, they're going to do a good job of actually vetting the validators that they take on. When it comes to correlated slashing, you know, we think it's a really great idea that Sunny and the kind of Tendermint team came up with. I think we're very bullish on that as well. Mostly for liveness, I would say. So, you know, I think it's really easy as a validator to just set up in the cloud in, you know, the same availability zone that kind of is default when people open up. Either Amazon or Google Cloud, and that can be really detrimental for the network. If one of these big cloud outages happens, you know, like the one that happened last year, where I think most of GCP's, I think networking infrastructure went down in the whole of the US. You know, we want these protocols to continue to maintain liveness even in these kind of fairly catastrophic events, and so. I think you know, having correlated slashing is a really great kind of protocol level motivator to not run in these places.
Okay, great. I'm going to dive into some of the questions as well, and so there's two that are I think are interesting. One is I do want to touch on the exchanges just because it is a subject that sort of comes up a lot, because obviously on one hand you guys are beholden to exchanges in a way. They're kind of often on-ramps for people to purchase tokens that haven't done so earlier. And so at the same time, exchanges now, you know, from mere means of pure exchange are moving into custody, obviously, and then also into staking. And, you know, for companies like us, it's kind of easy. We actually work with exchanges and stuff on that. So for us, it's just another customer cohort. But the reality for networks is it does present, at least that's my perspective, and I'm curious to hear what you think. What happens when you have folks like Binance, Coinbase, or large custodians who just by definition sit on huge token holdings, run a node and participate in the network. And so aggregating kind of token holder power, a lot of these token holders might just purely there for speculation, not care about your network, and yield control to these large exchanges. Sunny, I'll start with you first because Binance sort of popped into the top 10, I think, at Cosmos sort of, you know, one day to another. Probably not an unwelcome addition because Cosmos had a little bit of a, I don't know, it looked like it suffered from, you know, kind of top-heavy accumulation on certain nodes. Curious what you think about that and the exchanges.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was an inevitable thing that was going to happen. It makes a lot of sense with the exchange business model. Yeah, I mean, I think all we have to do is just make sure that the protocols are designed such that, like I said, the risks are borne upon, like if Binance is running a great validator and they're not double signing and like, you know, um, I guess I don't really see the big problem with that. I think that other validators have to come up with other offerings that can
Well,
compete
what
with
happens if
Binance.
they own 30% of the stake? And then you have two other nodes, and with that, they have over 51% of tokens.
Yeah, I mean, if that happens, then maybe the right approach is to fork the network or something. Like,
Right.
uh, there's no other. Yeah, at the end of the day, I guess that's what it comes down to. This is kind of like why sometimes on-chain governance is a bit scary, right? Because in consensus, there's not that much bad you can do if you have the ability to like fork, if you have the majority tokens, right? Like you could cause the chain to fork, but you're gonna get slashed, and then okay, now you gave up all your leverage.
Yeah.
When it comes to on-chain governance, now you have the you can maybe cause much more damage in that way, which is why personally I see on-chain governance not so much as a we don't have like automatic software upgrades on Cosmos for a reason, because of reasons like this.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's so interesting. Totally super subject. Marek, what do you think? How are you guys gonna handle it on chain?
Yeah. So a couple of things. So I think because every validator instance has the same voting weight in PBFT, if say Binance had that much stake, they would still have to run a lot of nodes, which may or may not be a big hassle for them, but at least from a kind of security and availability perspective, still maybe better than if they had all of that kind of voting weight in kind of just with one node in the network. So I think that's one thing that we've tried to do that makes it a little
Could they
better.
not run a custom software where they could keep like voting keys of, especially because you use BLS aggregation, right? Couldn't they just write custom software to keep all the keys on one node, aggregate them once, and then propagate?
They could. It's just more work for them to do that. Yeah, of course. I think the other thing is validator groups only allow 5 validators in each group. So then they would have to run 6 validator groups, so they would have to kind of spread their kind of vote across all of that. It's not impossible. It does add a little bit of extra operational complexity, which may be a slight kind of disadvantage if they wanted to do this. I do agree that governance is, I think, kind of a tricky thing to get right in this way. I think we've opted to have full on-chain governance for anything that is at the smart contract level. A lot of Celo's protocol is implemented in kind of Solidity, smart contracts, the proof of stake protocol, the governance protocol itself, the stability protocol, and the identity protocol. It's all in smart contracts, and any of those can be updated through a governance proposal that, if passed, automatically applies changes to these smart contracts. Again, we went back and forth a lot. I think there is a risk that that centralization will happen, and that a party with a lot of stake could potentially vote proposals that others may not want. But the flip side is that we can actually hopefully iterate much quicker after mainnet. And for us, we thought that iterating quickly is more important. Like there's just a lot of, it's just very difficult to upgrade a protocol once it's live for, I think, obvious reasons. It's decentralized, it's supposed to be difficult. But it does mean that in a world where there's just tons and tons of new protocols popping up, it just, if you want to kind of survive, I think, in this world, I think, being able to evolve is just going to be critical, right? If you were to look at what Google looked like, in its first few years after launch, it'd be laughable today. And so upgradability is just critical.
Yeah, the decentralized, the progressive decentralization. And I think what's interesting, what you alluded to, is obviously the different architectural and consensus mechanisms that allow you to have on-chain governance look very different than if you have an off-chain kind of method. And so it'll be interesting to see how that net out. I want to, and you know, that's a really interesting subject in itself. I do also want to touch on, we had 2 questions around that, and I'm going to respond from my side around both were one for Cosmos, one for Celo. Both your networks are relatively heavy in setup. As you said, OPSEC is important for you guys, so you don't want people running a validator that kind of isn't really secure. And so what are the plans to aid people to do this more easily over time? I'm going to say that our kind of main spiel at BlockDaemon is we build software products that allow you to actually you know, download an open source script to deploy a node on any Linux OS that actually gets fully synced up and works perfectly. And then we have monitoring instances around it. But obviously running a validator, you know, that's the software part where we normally work with foundations of those respective projects, and they help us, you know, we apply for a grant. So that's one way how to go about it. We try to be active early participants in those networks and see what tooling we can aid and develop for them in order to make it easy for people to operate nodes. On the hardware side, however, you know, there aren't really a lot of compromises that you can make outside of going to a validator as a service, which is, for example, what companies like us do as well, where you pay us in dollars a month, and we actually have the full setup that these guys need in order to physically run a node. And then you have the question of, you know, how does that affect centralization over time? But I'm curious, how do you think about software tooling being developed in your respective ecosystem? And so, Sunny, how do you guys, obviously you guys have a very, very active community. You know, we've tried to wiggle our way in there too and kind of see what tooling we can offer. It seems that the community you have already is so large and diversified that it's actually hard to pinpoint what the most usable thing is, because there's so many different, like other protocols like Terra and things like that that are interacting with your network actually have completely individual ecosystems. So curious how you think about that stuff.
Sorry, so what was the exact question?
How do you support the development of tooling so that everyday people over time, well, everyday people or people who want to run a validator can start to think about doing so without kind of becoming a top-tier validator company with 20 engineers and data centers?
Yeah, sure. So I think what happens is a lot of validators will go ahead and design tooling to make their own system more secure, and then they will open source it either, you know, as, you know, for publicity, or sometimes the Interchain Foundation will give grants to validators to open source some of this tooling, or, you know, sometimes they can you know, make a business model out of it. So, you know, earlier we had you know, Certus One talking, and so they were talking a little bit about their new SignOS tooling, which is a way of building like like, you know, sort of like a secure signing OS for running on the cloud validators. So that, you know, that's an example. Or, you know, for example, Figment has built tooling to make it very easy to you know, calculate your staking rewards, especially for like tax purposes and whatnot. And so they actually have a grant from the ICF now to sort of open source all of that. There's Chainflow has a grant to open source a lot of their like Sentry deployment tooling and monitoring tooling. There's a great project called Akash Network that's sort of, they're building their own Cosmos SDK chain, but one of the tools that they've built is this tool called Disco, which is sort of an open source deployment tooling that, like, for Kubernetes and whatnot. And so you know, I think that because a lot of it also helps that a lot of the validators in the Cosmos community are also developers for other chains, like for Bull, for example, right? And because of that, they are often building tooling for their own chains that then they contribute back to the Cosmos community. Like for Bull, for example, built an Explorer, but then they made this an open source Explorer, so that way, you know, if I'm running a testnet chain of my own, right, like I can actually use the for Bull like Explorer software, so I can actually, you know, visualize my own network as well, which is really useful. So I think that's kind of how we, combination of grants and people doing it for their own incentives, for their own chains, we kind of work together.
Cool. And then Marek, you guys are just starting your program, right? So you're about to kick it off. How does that work? And then you also have a sort of evergreen fund with one of your investors to invest in projects. I don't think that's a fund that invests in tooling, but they invest in projects that are built on top of it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So Polychain has a Celo ecosystem fund. It's a fund that will invest in your company if it's going to build on top of Celo or be in some way associated with the Celo ecosystem, and has a viable, I think, venture-style business model. And so that's maybe where tooling may or may not. I mean, I think it's still TBD, kind of fit those requirements. And that fund is interesting because Andreessen Horowitz is also an LP, and so these are some of the best kind of backers in the space today. And then we do have our foundation does have an ecosystem grant fund as well, which is kind of focused more on things that may not necessarily make sense from a kind of standalone business case, but are clearly, obviously, useful for the actual protocol. And so, if you're interested in building tooling or building something on Celo, a dApp or something, then that grant program can be a good avenue on that front. And then I think the final thing, maybe just to answer kind of the beginning part of your question, one thing that we've tried to do is to give people different tiers for how they can be involved. We want to make it possible for people to be involved in multiple different ways. You don't just have to run a validator in order to run the protocol. We already chatted about validator groups. That's another way to get involved. But then the final way that I think is potentially interesting is full nodes. So many protocols need full nodes to service like clients or to just service people looking to see the chain state. And in the Celo protocol, a full node servicing the Celo mobile app or kind of just Celo-like clients in general, those get a cut of the transaction fee for any transaction that they forward through into the peer-to-peer network. And so if you are interested in playing around with the protocol, but don't want to go to these kind of extremes of getting audited and finding a validator group to partner with, then running a full node is just running software, just like running proof of work is just running software, and it should over time, if there's like clients connecting to you, you should over time be able to kind of build a balance for your account. And so it kind of has that element that people really liked in proof of work networks that I think today in proof of stake networks has been hard to replicate, because you really have to either win some or buy some actual currency before you can actually participate. And so this is kind of another way to participate without having to do that.
Okay, great.
Oh, also, I forgot to mention one other source of funding for a lot of this tooling as well is like the on-chain community pool. So the grants are often managed by like these foundations and stuff, but on the Cosmos Hub, there's like a portion of all inflation goes towards this community pool, and then people can make requests from it to get funding for different tooling and stuff. And so I think this kind of goes back to like
which is the first of its kind, really, right? That was just sort of it's just sort of set up. It's actually super exciting. Yeah.
And so it kind of goes back to the title of this like panel, which is like, what are the requirements of a good network custodian? And so, in the Cosmos Hub, it's more than just like running running the architect infrastructure. Another requirement that we kind of expect is of all stakers is to be heavily like involved with the decision making of like where do these community grants go, community pool grants go and stuff. And so so the scope of the stakers is bigger than just running the infrastructure.
And so for the folks listening, if you're interested in any of that, both these projects have there's a lot of resources online about all these different bits and blog posts, things like that. One of the interesting challenges, one of the things that we're also working on is sort of trying to become a little bit of a Yelp of these projects, where on the BlockDaemon homepage we have protocol summaries and then ideally links of what are the latest software updates, the links to the hottest knowledge bases. And so, but you can research them on their respective sites. There's a ton of information on the Discords, and you'll find that if you ask questions and get involved in the chatter around these individual protocols, people are actually very open and communicative. And so there are really great online platforms that you can engage with this community with and actually continue this conversation. So folks like Sunny and Marek are actually also in those particular chat worlds.
I have a question if I can ask. Do we have time for a question?
Sure.
Yeah. So another question, one thing I've been thinking about is, what is the obligation of validators and other stakeholders in the network to be verifying the code that they're running? So this kind of goes back to that automatic software upgrade thing. Like, how do we incentivize validators to be verifying, like checking the code and like making sure the development team is not doing anything bad, and also incentivizing them to become accustomed to the code? One of the goals of Tendermint, like a very explicit goal, is that we should be able to, like, our next company retreat should, if a nuke falls on us and we all die, that hopefully Cosmos Hub can still continue to exist without our development team. And so and I think we're getting to that point where enough of the validators and other zone operators like have the technical expertise to do this. But how can we like accelerate and incentivize this process?
Well, I think as a node operator, if I may say one thing, and this is not the forum for it, listen, running nodes per se for stake is not a very profitable business over time. And so it's and that's one of the risks you have, is because the requirements you have in order to have a good network custodian means that there's the only sustainable business model, one of them, is economies of scale, which means you got to do it for 20 protocols en masse, which means the ability of companies to do this responsibly will decline over time. Who will be able to economically achieve it? That's sort of always my concern, because obviously I'm in the world of, I have a venture-backed business. I mean, this is one facet of what we do, but the economics are actually really complicated to make work. And they only work for us when we partner with large funds and investors who give us huge token allocations. And then the business model is, I want to do as little as possible while holding on to that token allocation without it getting slashed. And so it's because the actual community rewards for like bugs and all those type of things are often too little to make a difference at scale, right? And so it's a really interesting question. And I'm really curious to see how that nets out. I think we've seen a lot of companies pop up who run validators, and I think a lot of them are trying to figure out how to make that a sustainable business at scale. But any more operations is really complicated.
Yeah, and maybe just one final closing thought. I would maybe argue that for a person maybe in the audience who is interested in just doing this on the side, or I guess not as a venture-backed business, I would still think that this can be quite appealing. With Celo, you get actually stable coins as your reward for validating. You get 75K Celo dollars, which is pegged to the US dollar per year. And so if you run, say, 2 validators, that's $150,000 a year. I think an investor investing in a venture-style company will probably not get excited about that. But an individual looking to do something, even as their full-time job, that can be pretty meaningful and pretty compelling. And so I think it really depends.
Half of it is probably infrastructure-related costs of getting a colo and setting it up so the OPSEC requirements are fulfilled, right? And then, and so yeah, I mean, I think it's not a business model that works without taking token appreciation into account. But it'll be super curious to see how that unfolds. But I think the economic reality of node validators who only do staking and validation as a business model is going to be really interesting to see. And I actually believe that we'll see probably a few of them fall off, and then you can do it small, I think, if you're an individual. And so then I think it works, as you said. If you run 2 of them, you can somehow sort of probably get away with it. If you start offering insurance and all that type of stuff and run audits and financial things on top of it, you need to have other tiers of income flow in order to securely participate. We're out of time. There's a bunch of other talks around all these different subjects. So I want to thank, both of you guys, first and foremost. You guys are both awesome. We're super privileged and enjoyed working with both projects and running validators on each. And so I'm super excited to have had the opportunity to talk to 2 of the smartest people in the space. And and then I'm sure this Topio Labs will share links. You check out their respective sites, websites. There's a bunch of information there, and you can also reach out to BlockDaemon if you have any questions around running nodes.
Cool. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.